Hello, brothers and sisters, and welcome back to Dwight's Perspective. This is part 4 of our Count Volney docuseries, and fittingly, the 4th entry in our Detestable Author series. Now, if you're just joining us, here's a quick rundown of what you missed. In part 1, we meet Volney. Born into privilege, but tormented by a rebellious spirit. With deep-seated resentment and unresolved issues with his earthly father, he ultimately rejected his heavenly one, turning his back on Jesus Christ and the Word of God. In part 2, things escalated. Volney inherited a tidy fortune from his deceased mother, enrolled in a prestigious university, and began mingling with the elite. Then he headed off to Egypt and Syria, where he kept detailed records of his travels, and likely encountered esoteric currents already stirring in those ancient lands. In part 3, the plot thickened. Volney's political clout grew as Europe descended into chaos. We stepped back to examine Adam Weishaupt and the founding of the Illuminati, a sinister force that was supposedly abolished, yet lived on through new names and masks. One of those masks? The Jacobin Club. And yes, the Illuminati had already wormed their way into Freemasonry too. So, now you're all caught up. Let's dive into part 4, shall we? How do we know the Illuminati became the Jacobins? Well, let's first ask, is that even feasible? We're talking about the late 1700s here, not the age of smartphones, facial recognition, satellite surveillance, or, depending on when you're watching this, brain chips, QR code foreheads, chipped hands for buying and selling, and digital leashes. This wasn't the dystopian Big Brother Beast system nightmare we're sprinting toward today. Back then, secret societies didn't just survive, they thrived. No cameras, no digital footprints, no government database tracking your every move. If the Illuminati wanted to vanish, or rebrand themselves under a new banner, like, say, the Jacobins, not only was it possible, it was easy. Smaller populations meant fewer eyes, fewer bureaucrats, less red tape. In a village of a few thousand, it didn't take a massive conspiracy. Just a handful of highly motivated men could steer the entire ship off course. And let's not forget geography. This was still an era of thick forests, long stretches of unpatrolled roads, and secluded estates. Perfect for quiet meetings, indoctrination, and hiding in plain sight. Reinventing yourself didn't require a forged passport or fake ID. You just changed your name, changed your town, and no one could verify anything. The good old days. The Illuminati were masters of infiltration. They nested within Freemasonry, slipped into Enlightenment salons, the kind Count Volney frequented, and shaped the thoughts of rising intellectuals and revolutionaries. There was no internet, no search engines, just whispers, handwritten manifestos, and word of mouth. And believe it or not, That's all it took to light a revolutionary fire in the minds of men. Now try pulling that off today. You're up against border checkpoints, biometrics, and surveillance that follows you in real time. So, when you ask if the Illuminati could have morphed into the Jacobin Club, not only could they would have been fools not to. The conditions were perfect, and the proof is in the aftermath. Chaos, bloodshed, and a brand new political machine driven by Enlightenment fury and Luciferian ideals. As Christ said, quote, "By their fruits ye shall know them," end quote. And the fruits of the Jacobins? Mass executions, the de-Christianization of France, the enthronement of quote-unquote reason as a false god. But I'm getting ahead of myself. We'll dig into those quote-unquote fruits later. For now, ask yourself this. If you were a member of the Illuminati and your group had just been outlawed by the Bavarian government, what would you do? You'd scatter, regroup, hide in plain sight. And what better place to do that than within a new, rising political group already brimming with anger? Enter the Jacobins. Originally a tame discussion circle, the Jacobin Club mutated as the revolution grew darker. Its most radical leaders began to echo Illuminati doctrine, the destruction of monarchy, the abolition of religion, dismantling of the family, and the forced leveling of all hierarchies. Coincidence or infiltration? And again, infiltrating a movement in 1780s France didn't require a fake LinkedIn or a new social security number. It just required a sharp tongue and a new name. So when someone asks, how do we know the Illuminati became the Jacobins? The better question might be, how could they not? Now, let's shift our lens toward the powder keg that was the French Revolution. We've been taught in school that it was the desperate cry of the starving, a last gasp of a people suffocating under a bankrupt monarchy, a spontaneous uprising of the poor and oppressed, or so the story goes. But as we've learned with secret societies, the truth is rarely what it seems. Despite what your history textbook told you, the French monarchy, particularly under Louis XVI, was far from the tyrannical monster it's made out to be. In fact, by many historical accounts, it was second only to the British Crown in its benevolence toward its subjects. Professor Douglas Johnson, in his 1970 book, The French Revolution, points out that the 18th century hadn't been all that bad for France. The population was growing. There were no major famines, no foreign wars fought on French soil, and plagues were largely a thing of the past. The people, believe it or not, actually loved their king. But the revolution came anyway. Why? Because it was manufactured. You see, What we're witnessing with the French Revolution is not a spontaneous combustion. It was a slow, deliberate arson. For the first time in modern history, grievances weren't just exploited. They were systematically created for political gain. Think about that. It wasn't a revolt of the hungry. It was a takeover by the hidden hand. While mainstream historians insist that no more than 50,000 people died during the revolution, the reality is far darker. At least 300,000 souls were lost in the carnage, many by guillotine, firing squad, or sadly, starvation. And behind the curtain, secret societies. The same ones that had been slithering through France's intellectual salons and Masonic lodges were orchestrating the chaos. This wasn't just a revolution. It was a prototype. In fact, Russia's own revolutionary thinker, Prince Peter Kropotkin, admitted it openly in 1908. He called the French Revolution the quote-unquote Great Revolution, the source and origin of all modern communist, anarchist, and socialist ideologies. What we saw in France wasn't just a rebellion, guys. It was the birth of the New World disorder. And we haven't stopped living in its shadow since. Some of America's own founding fathers, blinded by the glittering slogans of quote-unquote liberty and quote-unquote equality, fell under the same hypnotic spell cast over France. Caught up in the Masonic mania of the age, they cheered the quote-unquote Great Revolution with naive enthusiasm. Chief Justice John Marshall, one of the most powerful men to ever sit on the U.S. Supreme Court, proudly declared, quote, "In no other part of the globe was this revolution held with more joy than in America," end quote. But joy over what exactly? Let's pull the curtain back. Who orchestrated the French Revolution? And more importantly, why? The answer is chilling. By 1783, 3 years before the Illuminati was officially outlawed in Bavaria, its agents were already embedding themselves in France like termites in an old cathedral. In fact, just 5 years after their supposed quote-unquote suppression, one man blew the whistle. That man, Count Alessandro di Cagliostro, an occultist, magician, and insider. Under interrogation by the Holy See in Rome, he revealed that the Illuminati hadn't died at all. Quite the opposite. They were thriving, and France was next on the chopping block. Cagliostro testified that when he was initiated in 1783, the rites were read from an ancient manuscript. The message was unmistakable. Illuminism was a conspiracy, a war plan. Target, thrones, and altars. Phase 1, take down the French monarchy. Phase 2, deliver a death blow to Christianity, starting with its earthly center, the Catholic Church. He went on to explain how German Illuminists had been infiltrating French Masonic lodges for years. slowly indoctrinating them without their full knowledge. By March of 1789, the Grand Orient of France controlled 266 lodges, and all of them, every single one, had already been quote-unquote illuminized. Only a tiny inner circle knew the true nature of the beast. The rest, useful pawns, revolutionary fuel, mysteries whispered in dark corners, truths hidden behind degrees and rituals, all leading up to the real unveiling. And then, like clockwork, the revolution ignited in April. Coincidence? Or was the guillotine merely the grand opening of an operation decades in the making? Let's be clear. Louis XVI's monarchy wasn't perfect. Reforms were needed. But was it the brutal tyranny the revolutionaries claimed? Not even close. Arthur Young, a British historian famous for criticizing the old regime, admitted, quote, "The old government of France, with all its faults, was certainly the best enjoyed by any considerable country in Europe, England alone excepted." End quote. Even Thomas Jefferson, Count Volney's close friend and a man who would later cheer for the blood-soaked revolution, had to admit the truth when he actually saw France for himself. In 1787, he wrote to Lafayette, quote, "I have been pleased to find among the people a less degree of physical misery than I had expected. They are generally well clothed and have plenty of food." End quote. So, why the shock? Because men like Jefferson had been fed lies. Illuminized Masonic circles, the same secret networks Volney was connected to, they painted the monarchy as cruel and oppressive to justify tearing it down. The people were not starving, not until someone made sure they would. And here's the Christian truth hiding in all of this. Satan is the father of lies, and his playbook hasn't changed. John chapter 8, verse 44 tells us he was a murderer from the beginning. Quote, "Not holding to the truth, for there is no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks his native language." End quote. The revolution wasn't born out of hunger. It was born out of deception. The Illuminized Masons intentionally created chaos because no revolution begins in comfort. It begins when comfort is ripped away, when truth is replaced with lies, and when people are driven to desperation. What happened next was predictable. Bloodshed, betrayal, and a nation spiritually gutted. This was not just political rebellion. It was a spiritual war, and France was its first modern battlefield. After their exposure in Bavaria, the Illuminati didn't disappear, remember? They simply slipped deeper into the shadows. They rebranded themselves under new names, one of which was the French Revolutionary Club. and as radicals poured in, they needed a bigger stage. So they leased the old hall of the Jacobins' convent. From that hall, they took their new name, the Jacobin Club. And this wasn't just a ragtag group of angry peasants. No, the Jacobins quickly became a who's who of France's intellectual elite. Among its 1,300 members were some of the most influential men in the country, including, yes, our boy Count Volney himself, a founding member. The Jacobins had one mission: destroy the monarchy and every other institution standing in their way. Their endgame? What they proudly called a, quote, New World Order, end quote. Or, in their words, a quote-unquote Universal Republic. But here's the kicker. To ignite a revolution, you need a spark, and they found it. They created the chaos themselves. The formula they used has been recycled in almost every revolution since. Number 1, unleash lawlessness. They hired radical thugs to wreak havoc in the streets. Think Antifa. Number 2, then demand quote-unquote law and order. Their influential members screamed for control, and in that false wave of justice, thousands of Frenchmen were hauled to the guillotine. The Jacobins weren't reacting to chaos. They engineered it and set the stage with an atmosphere of repression. Nesta Webster exposed just how organized this machine was. Quote, the Jacobin clubs were organized by the Revolutionary Committee under the direct inspiration of the Bavarian Illuminati, who taught them their, quote, method of doing business, of managing their correspondence, and of procuring and training pupils, end quote. It was thus that at a given signal, insurrections could be engineered simultaneously in all parts of the country, end quote. And they were efficient. By 1791, every Masonic lodge in France had been shut down. Why? Because the Jacobins, now in control, feared the same trick they had pulled themselves. They worried Masonry could be used as cover for a counter-revolution. History would repeat itself 150 years later. Hitler, after using Freemasonry to claw his way to power, turned around and crushed it too. Same playbook, different tyrant. And here's the spiritual truth behind all this. Satan doesn't care who he uses. Jacobins, Nazis, Antifa, or anyone else. His kingdom thrives on chaos, deception, and betrayal. His tactics never change because they work. Okay, now let's hone in on 1789, the year the fuse was lit. The approved schoolbook version that was pushed on us as children claims, quote-unquote, the people of France rose up united as one against tyranny. However, those of us who've studied the revolution in depth have discovered the record says otherwise. It was manufactured, as I mentioned earlier, engineered with precision, like a stage play, with the Illuminati writing the script and men like the Duke of Orleans directing the actors. By the spring and summer of 1789, the stage was set. An artificial grain shortage was created, not by drought, but by calculated market manipulation. Agents tied to the Duke of Orleans, the womanizing Grand Master of the Grand Orient Masonic Lodges, and an Illuminist insider, bought up grain, concealed it, or shipped it out of the country. At the same time, the National Assembly blocked every reform that might have relieved the people's suffering. The misery was intentional. The people of France had to boil over. The goal was simple: create quote-unquote popular grievances to exploit and sell the lie that the king was to blame. The grievances followed a script. Number 1, grain scarcity, engineered famine to stir unrest. Nesta Webster, in her book, The French Revolution, put it this way, quote, French lawyer and man of letters Monchois asserts that agents employed by the Duke of Orleans deliberately bought up the grain and either sent it out of the country or concealed it in order to drive the people to revolt. End quote. This tactic is similar to the one detailed by Jan Kozak in his book, Not a Shot is Fired, written about 160 years later. Number 2, debt drumbeat. A crushing 4.5 billion livres, 2/3 from loans to aid America's revolution, was used to justify higher taxes. This is worth about 800 million in the dollar of the day, according to A. Ralph Epperson in his book, The Unseen Hand. Number 3, starvation narrative, painted everywhere. Even as observers like English physician and writer Dr. Edward Rigby noted that French commoners were not universally, quote, in rage, idleness, and misery, end quote. And that the real oppression was worse in parts of Germany. Webster, in the French Revolution, explained, quote, Dr. Rigby continues in the same strain of admiration, an admiration that we might attribute to a lack of discernment, were it not that it ceases abruptly on his entry into Germany. Here he finds a, quote, country to which nature has been equally kind as to France, for it has fertile soil, but as yet the inhabitants live under an oppressive government, end quote. At Cologne, Germany, he finds that, quote, tyranny and oppression have taken up their abode, end quote. Number 4, paper flood. About 35 million assignats printed in short order, causing massive inflation, which was bankrupting the working classes and contributing to the cause of shortages. The government's response was to impose food rationing, and this further continued to anger the people. This tactic is, once again, similar to the strategy detailed in the book, and Not a Shot is Fired. Number 5, demonize the king. bury the truth that France was the most prosperous of all the European states prior to the Revolution. France held 1/2 of the money in circulation in all of Europe. And in the period of 1720 to 1780, foreign trade was multiplied by 4. 1/2 of the wealth in France was in the hands of the middle class, and the quote-unquote serfs owned more land than anyone else. The king had abolished forced labor on public works in France and had outlawed the use of torture and interrogation. In addition to all that, the king had founded hospitals, established schools, reformed the laws, built canals, drained the marshes to increase the amount of arable land, and had constructed numerous bridges to ease the flow of goods inside the country. Enter Volney. Elected as a deputy for Anjou to the third estate of the Estates General, he was already a celebrated figure, comparable to Hulk Hogan in the late 1980s. His lodgings were a hub for deputies. He moved in the inner circle of French writer, orator, and statesman Mirabeau, French priest and writer C.S., French writer and politician Pétion, French journalist Brissot, and was counted among the leaders of the Breton Club with French politician and orator Barnave. He stood with the Third Estate at the tennis court oath, and his first words in the assembly called for the publicity of debates, turning the assembly into theater and the people into a weapon. He supported the creation of the National Guard and the reorganization of communes and departments, draining power from the monarchy into revolutionary councils. He helped shape the rhetoric that would drive the Third Estate from reform to destruction, and attack the church with the same zeal he turned on the throne. Then came July 14, the storming of the Bastille. History paints it as a righteous blow against tyranny. In truth, it was nothing more than a premeditated arms raid. As Nesta Webster explained it, quote, "A plan of attack on the Bastille had already been drawn up. It only remained now to set the people in motion." End quote. The so-called people in motion was not the vast tide of French citizenry so often romanticized in modern retellings. Despite what countless YouTube documentaries would have us believe, the revolution was not the irresistible uprising of an entire nation. This is a myth, a carefully cultivated illusion. The reality is far starker. Quote, "Out of the 800,000 inhabitants of Paris, only approximately 1,000 took any part in the siege of the Bastille." End quote. And even here, the truth cuts deeper. Those at the forefront of the assault were not the spontaneous champions of liberty they were later painted to be. They were hirelings, men bought and paid for by the very hands that orchestrated the entire affair. The siege was not born of the people's will, but of a calculated design, executed through coin and command. The evidence for this does not come from rumor or hearsay. It comes from the historical record itself. Quote, that brigands from the south of France were deliberately enticed to Paris in 1789, employed and paid by the revolutionary leaders, is a fact confirmed by authorities too numerous to quote at length. And the further fact that the conspirators felt such a measure to be necessary is of immense significance, for it shows that in their eyes the people of Paris were not to be depended on to carry out a revolution. In other words, the importation of the contingent of hired brigands conclusively refutes the theory that the revolution was an irrepressible rising of the people. End quote. And believe it or not, the deception runs deeper still. In addition, not only Frenchmen were employed by those directing the revolution. Quote, the motley crew of quote-unquote brigands, thirsting for violence, consisting not only of the aforesaid Marseille, those Frenchmen from the quote-unquote South we cited previously, and Italians, but also of a large number of Germans, end quote. The presence of these Germans is no coincidence. You will recall, we have already traced the guiding hand of the Illuminati, born in Bavaria, nourished in the German states, moving beneath the surface of the French upheaval. Here, in the very composition of the hired mob, we see their fingerprints again. The revolution was not the uprising of a single people, but the operation of an international engine, one that could summon its agents from beyond France's borders whenever the work of demolition required fresh hands. And yet, for all the blood and thunder that followed, what was this grand assault on the Bastille said to have accomplished? The official story tells us of a noble act, the liberation of political martyrs from the clutches of tyranny. But here again, the legend collapses under the weight of the record. The plan of the attack was to storm the Bastille, not to release the hundreds of quote-unquote oppressed political prisoners supposedly imprisoned there, but to capture the needed weapons to start the revolution. This was confirmed by the fact that, when the mob reached the Bastille, so-called quote-unquote torturous prison of the quote-unquote oppressive King Louis XVI, there were only 7 prisoners incarcerated there. 4 forgers, 2 lunatics, and the Count Volney, incarcerated for, quote, monstrous crimes against humanity, at the request of his own family. In fact, quote, the damp, dark dungeons had fallen into complete disuse. Since the first ministry of Necker in 1776, no one had been imprisoned there, end quote. Even French historians now acknowledge that the purpose of the revolutionaries was not to destroy the Bastille or to liberate the prisoners, but to steal arms and gunpowder. And so the grand drama so often cast as a nation's awakening, was in reality a carefully staged prelude to organized violence. One who was in a position to witness the actual siege of the Bastille was a previously mentioned Dr. Rigby, who just so happened to be a tourist in Paris during the Revolution. His letters to his wife from these days offer a candid glimpse into the reality behind the legend. As Nesta Webster records in The French Revolution, quote, "So little commotion did the siege of the Bastille cause in Paris that Dr. Rigby, unaware that anything unusual was going on, went off early in the afternoon to visit the gardens of Monceau." End quote. Here, preserved in the casual decision of a foreign visitor, lies the measure of the event's immediate impact. Beyond the narrow stage of the hired mob, the life of Paris flowed on, scarcely aware that history, or rather, the myth of history, was being manufactured in its midst. Now, his ignorance was not due to indifference, but to the simple fact that, beyond the confines of the hired mob, there was little to suggest a revolution had begun. The storming of the Bastille, for all its later glory, passed in Paris with scarcely more notice than a summer's distraction. And yet, within days, a terror far greater than the siege itself would sweep across France. Villages, towns, and provinces erupted in panic as rumors spread like wildfire. Whispers of brigands marching on the countryside, of foreign armies descending, of noble plots to starve the land into submission. This was Le Grand Peur, quote unquote, the Great Fear, one of the most elaborately timed episodes of psychological warfare ever unleashed upon a nation. Thus armed, on July 22nd, 1789, the Jacobins set into motion one of the most elaborately timed revolutionary exercises ever attempted. History remembers it as Le Grand Peur, the Great Fear. A panic was manufactured, not organically born, but carefully sown across the countryside. Horsemen raced from town to town, breathlessly declaring, quote-unquote, brigands were on the march, and that every citizen must take up arms. The message was insidious. The conspirators, it was claimed, found shelter in the larger estates, the chateau, and, quote, by edict of the king, all should be torched, end quote. The peasants, loyal to their monarch and believing they obeyed his will, complied. What began as a lie spread like wildfire, and soon literal fire consumed the land. The flames of destruction rose over France's manors, fields, and villages. What followed was not a noble uprising, but chaos unchained. Raiding, pillaging, and plunder carried on under the mask of revolution, and not only for bread. The American minister in Paris, Gouverneur Morris, himself one of the architects of the U.S. Constitution, recorded with alarm the true condition of the city in July 1789. He wrote that Paris was a country, quote, as near to anarchy as society can approach without dissolution. The authority of the king and the nobility is completely subdued. I tremble for the Constitution, end quote. If Morris's words captured the surface chaos, another observer of the revolution discerned something even more sinister beneath it. Lord Acton confirmed that the upheaval was not the product of blind tumult, but of hidden design. Quote, the appalling thing in the French Revolution is not the tumult, but the design. Through all the fire and smoke, we perceive the evidence of calculating organization. The managers remain studiously concealed and masked, but there is no doubt about their presence from the first. End quote. Here the illusion is stripped away. What seemed to be an uncontrollable storm of the people was, in fact, a directed tempest, carefully guided by unseen hands. The panic of the provinces, the riots of Paris, even the symbolic fall of the Bastille, each piece bore the mark of orchestration. And though the architects remained cloaked in shadow, their presence was unmistakable. A conspiracy not of rumor, but of record. And who were these concealed, quote-unquote, managers? The answer is no longer a matter of speculation. We have already traced the current back to Bavaria, to the sect that called itself the Illuminati. Their doctrines have been smuggled into France through secret societies. Their agents mingled in the Jacobin clubs. Their currency bought the mobs that stormed the Bastille. And their propaganda fanned the flames of the Great Fear. Acton's words confirm what the facts reveal, that behind the mask of the revolution lay an international design, a calculated program to uproot throne and altar alike. But where does Volney enter this dark machinery? Through it all, Volney climbed higher. In November 1789, he was elected one of the secretaries of the National Constituent Assembly. A dispute over plural office holding forced him to choose between that royal post and his deputyship. He chose the assembly. Less a street agitator than ideological engineer, he continued shaping the revolution's course. Ill health and a weak voice limited his oratory in the vast hall of 1,200 deputies, but away from the floor, he worked relentlessly, drafting, networking, and refining the manuscript of Les Runes, the book that would clothe unbelief in philosophical respectability. More on that later. Here was no mere observer of the revolution, but a man who gave it intellectual structure. Where the mob provided chaos, Volney provided doctrine. Where the hired brigands furnished violence, he provided justification. While the Illuminati labored to dismantle the old order, Volney's pen labored to erase its moral framework. His rise was not incidental. It was absolutely essential. The Bastille was not the uprising of a nation. It was the staged theater of hired mobs. The Great Fear was not a spontaneous panic. It was a weaponized rumor, spreading fire and terror across the countryside. And in Paris, even foreign diplomats trembled as law and order collapsed into chaos. But through the smoke and the ruin, one figure quietly advanced. Volney. Not with a soldier's shout, but with a philosopher's pen, he rose within the assembly, preparing a book that would clothe unbelief in the garments of reason. What he wrote in Les Runes not only shaped the revolution, but would echo far beyond France, laying groundwork for the very new world order itself. That story, however, is for the next installment. Yet, as we pause here, let us remember, though men conspire and philosophies arise to erase the faith of nations, their power is but fleeting. Quote, "The counsel of the Lord standeth forever, the thoughts of his heart to all generations." End quote. Psalm 33:11. Thrones may fall and altars may be profaned, but I can promise you this: Christ's kingdom cannot and will not ever be shaken. Thank you for watching this episode. If you found it helpful in some way, please like, share, and subscribe to help spread the whispered truth behind the mask of history. And as always, may the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ be with you and yours, guiding your discernment and keeping you steadfast in the faith until he returns. God bless.